There's definitely a huge amount of experimentation going on. There's one school of thought that says that this phase of human life is just a passing blip. So give it however many years in the future, and we won't be around as these sort of carbon-based life forms. We're just an evolutionary period in time that then disappears, and there's nothing that says that human life must carry on into the future. So that's kind of a tricky one to get your head around, and some people say that implanting chips into your brain is the stepping stone to humans disappearing completely. Time will tell. I'm agnostic on that one.
Hello, welcome to the University of Hull's Inspired in Hull podcast. This is where we bring graduates of the university back to campus to have interesting conversations about what they're doing in their career and what they've learned since leaving us. Today we're in the DAME building, the building at the Centre of Excellence for Artificial Intelligence, data science and modelling at the University of Hull. And we've brought back a really outstanding graduate, Sue Turner, OBE, to have a conversation about artificial intelligence and the ethics of using artificial intelligence. Sue is the founding director of AI Governance, and she's a business and charity leader in the west of England. She's also one of the most influential people in AI ethics in the world, and we're looking forward to a really fantastic conversation with her today. Hi Sue, welcome back to the University of Hull. I thought we'd start today with a question about what actually artificial intelligence is. A lot of us will have encountered artificial intelligence in science fiction and movies. We might think HAL or Holly from Red Dwarf, but that's not really how we use AI today, is it? Could you tell us a little bit about what we mean when we talk about artificial intelligence?
Sure, and thanks for having me back here today. It's been a real pleasure to spend time around the students. And I spend a lot of my time working with companies and leaders of all sorts of organisations. And the first question always is, well, what is artificial intelligence? What are we talking about? And the answer is that there is no single definition of what AI is. The idea has been around since the 1950s, so almost 70 years. But even so, there's still no one standard definition of what it is we mean. Broadly, what we're talking about is computers finding patterns hidden in large amounts of data and then using those patterns to predict, to personalise or to automate something. And that's it in a nutshell. Is there a pattern? If there is, can we use it to predict, personalise or automate something?
Is that intelligence?
Well, a lot of people would say no, and this is some of the big debates that are going on at the moment about, are we actually going to get to a point where we really do have intelligence? And that comes under this broad banner of artificial general intelligence. We don't have that at the moment, as far as we know, though somebody out there might be working on it. So what we have at the moment is what's called narrow artificial intelligence, where we can set up a model to do a very specific task. So, for example, it might be looking at x-rays of people's lungs and being able to predict, as well as a trained human can do, whether those have cancer or don't have cancer. And you don't train the model by telling it this is what a cancer cell looks like. You train it by giving it, in this case, thousands of images of x-rays of lungs, some of them marked with cancer, some of them marked no cancer, and the machine figures out for itself what it's actually looking for, what makes the difference between the two sets of images, until, as I say, it can predict from a new set of images with no label on them which show cancer and which don't, as well as a very highly trained human can.
That's really interesting. So I think there's lots of sort of different uses that people have made of artificial intelligence at the moment. We might encounter it through looking at chat GPT, for instance. We might use that to sort of find things out or write essays, for instance, is one of the uses I think people have made of it. How much has this changed the game, in your opinion, in terms of how we go about doing things?
Yeah, so when I first started studying AI, that was back in September 2020, and there we were talking all the time about tools that you had to be pretty specialised to use or work in an environment where you had a lot of money, frankly, to be able to pay to get data and to be able to process and use these tools. So it wasn't particularly mainstream, and then the advent of ChatGPT in November 2022 has really blown the whole thing up, and it's created the opportunity for people to start experimenting with artificial intelligence tools and trying out different things. And the issue for me is when people are trying these tools without understanding that they are basically still giant prediction engines. They're not necessarily surfacing truth. They might be, but they might not be. So once you understand that it's just making a prediction about what an image might look like, or what some music might sound like, or what words you might want to put in your essay, then you kind of start to understand the limits of what you're dealing with. And that's crucial for me, that people understand the limits of these tools and don't think that they've got some all-powerful godlike ability and that they're always right, because they're not. They're quite often wrong.
How likely is it that we might move to a place where they are godlike or omniscient or...
Yeah, so lots of people want this to happen, and this would be the artificial general intelligence that I've mentioned, where you get to a stage where the AI is better at thinking than humans are. It can process way more data and do it far more quickly, and know everything, know everything that is possible to know. My personal view is that we won't get to that in our current way of processing data, that our current ways of dealing with data are too clunky to get us to that extra level of processing power. However, if we can get to quantum computing that is done on a big enough scale that we can process in a very different way from the way we understand computing today, that I think will be the breakthrough that would mean we could get to that artificial general intelligence, which then becomes potentially an existential threat. The computer's then way superior to us and growing in knowledge and power all the time. We wouldn't be able to control them. So that's why lots of people at the moment are talking about those potential future threats and thinking about what controls we might need to put in place today in order to guard against that future risk.
What is quantum computing?
I'm not the best person to explain what quantum computing is. My understanding of it is it's able to, whereas traditional computing processes things in either a 0 or a 1, quantum computing has everything in all states all the time, and so its ability then to just fantastically process existing data very quickly and find out all possible answers, all possible scenarios, is just in order that I think our human brains find quite difficult to contemplate.
I'm finding it hard to balance the sort of optimistic opportunities that might come out of it and also the terrifying, horrendous sort of outcomes that might also come used in the wrong hands.
Yeah, and I think it's worth having that debate with ourselves now, because even the types of artificial intelligence we have today, which aren't that all-powerful state, people make mistakes with them all the time. Companies are making mistakes with the way they use them, and some of them are mistakes that just make us, head slap, but others are things that can have serious consequences for real people's lives. So, for example, Apple, we all know and love Apple, or don't, whatever, but we all know it. They put out a credit card in 2019, and it very quickly became apparent that it granted more credit to men than it did to women. So Apple was asked, why is it doing this? What's actually happening in the machine that's making these decisions about how much credit to let people have on their credit cards? And Apple said, we don't know. It wasn't their algorithm, actually. They partnered with Goldman Sachs. So Goldman Sachs were asked, what's going on here? And Goldman Sachs said, our algorithm can't be biased against gender because we don't include bias as a feature in the data that we're using to make decisions about what credit people get. Now that showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how data works, because actually you can infer things like gender from other data in the data set, and that's what had gone on here. So actually it would have been more helpful to have gender data in the data so you can actually start looking for bias rather than taking it out in the first place. So that sort of thinking, we really need companies to understand data better, to understand how their algorithms are using it, what potentially they're getting wrong, in order to avoid some of those horrible mistakes.
That's really interesting, and I want to come back to that. But before we do, I wanted to ask you a little bit about why you chose to get involved in it, because you spoke to some students on campus today about your career, about the work that you're doing and the way you've been working with businesses. And one of the things that really stood out to me was your sense of purpose and how purpose plays a big role when you're talking to charities, because you do a lot of charity work, and to businesses. So I wondered if we could take a step back from the AI for a minute and look at why, what your motivations are and why you get involved in the things that you do.
Yeah. I guess it goes back to about 2018 for me, where I could see that these new technologies were getting more and more powerful, and I could see how much data that we each individually were giving over to a very small number of companies and people who were getting very, very rich and powerful from it. And I've worked throughout my career to try and shift power, if you like, to help people who are less advantaged get more of the advantages in life. So I've seen this sort of centralisation of power just made me thought, I want to do something that helps shift that power and give ordinary people, disadvantaged people and communities more opportunity, rather than just having their data taken off them and being given very little back in return. So I actually set up a dinner in February 2020, so it was the last public event I did before COVID madness. And there we had a group of technology experts, a group of philanthropists, and a group from communities all in the room to see, could we bring technology together to help disadvantaged people, to actually create some more philanthropy and do more good. And it was a fascinating conversation because the tech people in the room were all sort of going, oh yes, we're a very fine business. We send some of our people into schools once a year and they help convince people to take up careers in technology. And some of the community people around the room put their hands up and said, yeah, we actually work with the kids who don't go to school, so you're never going to reach them. And you could see the technologists going, bing, I hadn't thought of that. Another time they talked about an app that they'd created to help young people in a certain way. And again, the community people said, hang on a minute, we're talking about the kids who don't have the money to have the data always on and the smartphone to be able to use your app. Again, you could see the technologists going, oh, there's a whole new world we hadn't thought about. So if I can learn, this is why I came to do the MSc, if I can learn more about these tools and technologies and help spread that knowledge amongst people, and if I can talk to the technologists and help them understand what life's like in disadvantaged communities, then I'm serving a purpose in life and I'm doing some good. That's why I chose to do the degree.
I think it's really interesting you said that about sort of like, I guess, opening it up and rebalancing that power.
Yeah.
Because AI obviously has this potential to put the world in the hands of anybody. Mm. But I guess like the question is, will it, or will corporations and other entities gatekeep it and keep that power for themselves?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or will they allow it to be something used for the benefit more widely to some of the children, for instance, that you're talking about?
I think my fear is that, knowing how companies work, that they will tend to say what's good for them, how do they make profit, and so they'll allow people to use all sorts of tools and technologies and get their hands on all sorts of information in wonderful ways which are incredibly enriching, but it's to serve their purpose. So either they're taking our data off us in order to be the transaction, we're giving our data away for free to get this other stuff in return, or they charge us. So we're already seeing that with Microsoft's new Copilot, which sits alongside as an AI tool sitting behind the whole Office suite of tools, potentially incredibly powerful, very enriching to our lives in lots of ways. They've got to pay a subscription to get it. And that means that certain chunks of the world are excluded from it because they won't be able to afford those subscriptions. And other chunks of the world will be able to, and they will get a different service, a different lot of abilities in life. And fundamentally, to me, that seems unfair. And the other thing that seems very unfair is when you work, as I have done, in the not-for-profit sector, you see how tiny the budgets are in so many not-for-profit organisations, same for public sector organisations as well. So again, if we're saying that if you're a corporate, if you're a big business, you can have all these wonderful tools to play with, but if you're a not-for-profit or public sector organisation, sorry, you don't get your hands on it, or you just can't afford to have the best. That doesn't seem fair. So again, the more we can educate and inform people in those less advantaged organisations, then they can get their hands on these tools or develop them in different ways or come up with deals or just put pressure on the big corporates to give them equal access.
So following on from that, and also just to return to the subject of Apple and their sort of issue with the credit cards, I was wondering, because like, again, maybe it's my science fiction sort of background and everything, but like you have this image of people who, thought about if they could, like to use a quote you've used from Jurassic Park, if they could do something, but they didn't stop to think about if they should. And you think about like maybe some malicious figures using this technology for their own advantage, but quite a lot of the examples that you've used have actually not been so much malice as sort of obliviousness, I guess.
Yeah.
What's the biggest threat? Like?
Yeah, I think when you're dealing with ethics, a lot of it is about grey areas. There isn't one obvious right choice. When I'm talking to data scientists, to people who are heads of AI and to people who are non-technical people in organisations as well, their lack of knowledge quite often leads them to make choices that when you look back on it, you say, oh, it's a really poor choice ethically. Very few people, I think it's different now for students. Lots of students do get training in ethics, and certainly in the MSc course here in Hull, we had ethics built into every single module, and that was brilliant. But go back 10 years and more, people didn't get training on ethics when they were doing a business and management degree, for example. So they kind of make it up as they go along, and they've not always got a very good frame of reference, and quite often they just don't want to think about ethics because it's difficult stuff and they haven't been trained on it. So people are making decisions based on gut feel and sometimes purely on ignorance, and they haven't thought through the consequences. Some of that is because you've got a quite often monotone group of people in a room, very similar backgrounds, very similar educations. They're not challenging each other. And one of the great things about the master's degree here is it's specifically set up as a conversion course to bring in people who do come from different life experiences, who do come from different backgrounds. And we really need those in the AI and data science workforce in order to bring different life experience and challenge some of those assumptions and make people think more.
So you mentioned that those people who maybe are sort of like monotone people in business who are making the decisions. When you're working with them, when you're sort of advising them or discussing the ethics of their business, what are the challenges that they're seeing in terms of incorporating AI, and what are the opportunities that they're sort of seeing as well?
Yeah, I get brought in by quite often the boards of organisations, and the first question they're asking is exactly where you and I started: what is AI anyway? And then the second thing they ask about is what are the opportunities to use it in our business? They don't always ask, but I always then go on to tell them what are the threats, what are the risks that you're opening yourself up to when you do this. And they'll quite often get really excited about the opportunities, and we'll spend a long time talking about how they might use it in their particular domain, and that might be an energy and infrastructure company, it might be logistics, it might be financial services, could be absolutely anything, healthcare. There's uses for it absolutely everywhere. But then being able to move people on and say, okay, well, if you did do this, just because you can doesn't mean you should, so what are the implications? And other alternatives as well. So sometimes we end up actually saying that there's a quite straightforward data science solution. If you analyse the data and produce some decent business information, you can get 90% of the way to what you're wanting, rather than necessarily having to go all the way and have a machine learning model and artificial intelligence automating a process for you. So sometimes actually it's a straightforward, simple answer that we want people to look for, rather than saying, oh, the most exciting thing is ChatGPT, we have to work out a way to use that. Perhaps you don't. Perhaps there's some simpler steps which are more cost effective, less expensive, and have a lower impact on the planet as well, because using some of these large tools can be very energy intensive processing. That uses energy, it uses water as well to cool down data centres. So there are environmental impacts when we use these tools, and they need to be thought about as well.
Do you think those environmental issues are going to maybe put a limit on how far it can expand, or is it?
They ought to, but not enough people talk about them, and not enough people are thinking about those environmental impacts. So they're just saying, oh, I've got this tool, I'll use it, and someone else can worry about the environmental impact. Oh, I'll just get on and use it because it serves my purpose. A bit like saying, I'll hop on an aeroplane and rely on someone else not to, or whatever. So I don't think it's enough talked about for people to really take it seriously. But I do come across some companies where they've made a really strong commitment to reduce their CO2 emissions. And one I was talking to recently, they're already net zero. So they're very aware then that they don't want to start using a tool which then makes them have a positive contribution of CO2. So some of them are more aware than others, and I guess I'm in a privileged position. I recognise that I do tend to work with the people and organisations that are being more thoughtful about this, rather than the ones that are just laissez-faire and want to make a buck.
What now that we've sort of had this, let's say, disheartening conversation about businesses, I was just wondering, as consumers, as people who are putting our data onto the internet in so many ways that we probably don't even realise, what should we be worried about?
That's a huge one. I think as consumers, we've got in the habit, aren't we, of just ticking the box when it says, consent to give your data, consent to do this, that and the other. I think we have to be really more aware in the future of what we're actually consenting to. So there is a movement, which I'm part of, which says if you're going to use AI responsibly, you as the organisational leaders need to make sure people are giving informed consent. So rather than just saying, I'll tick this box to get access to my tool, and by the way, you just consented to a load of stuff that you haven't read, actually be saying to people at different stages, if you do the next step, then we are going to use this data in this way. So for example, supposing you were signing up for something from a bank, to be able to say to people, rather than just to access the banking app, tick here and then we take all your data forever, to then actually say to people at a later stage, you've now applied for a credit card, we will use the following tools to process your data and decide what level of credit you get. That's again asking people to be thoughtful about sharing their data. But I do think too many people are just in a habit of giving their data away, and they don't realise yes, they appear to be getting something for free, but that data is incredibly valuable to those companies, and that our whole world is being built on that enormous amount of data.
So earlier on today, you spoke, as we said, you spoke to some students on campus. The event was titled "Using AI with Wisdom and Integrity." That's your company AI governance sort of slogan. I was wondering if you could tell us what it would actually look like to use artificial intelligence with wisdom and integrity, and then on the flip side, what using it with, I guess, like stupidly and lacking in integrity would sort of look like.
Yeah. So when we talk about using AI with wisdom and integrity, there's a framework called the Responsible AI framework that we espouse, which really is trying to get companies to think through. I won't go through them all, but there's 9 different factors to think through about how you're using AI, and that's asking yourself questions about: is the data that we're using actually fair, or is there statistical bias or societal bias baked into it? What are we doing about privacy, for example? Are we exposing this data potentially to being hacked or used in ways that are not desirable? So there's a whole lot of factors that we get people to think about. And if they do it right, then quite often they will make decisions to use tools in different ways. So one example comes from Xerox, the big American office equipment company. They wanted to do some work to reduce the amount of people that were leaving the company in quite a short space of time after they'd been recruited. So they looked at their data and they realised that people who lived further away from the site in one part of America were more likely to leave within 6 months. They said, okay, fine, so when we're recruiting new people in, we can put into our algorithm to exclude people that live beyond a certain distance away, and that will achieve our aim of cutting the attrition rate. Fantastic. Except a bright spark in the company spoke up and said, hang on a minute, if we do that, that means we're going to exclude people who don't live so close to the site. Yeah, by definition. Well, our site's in quite an affluent area. So people who live further away tend to be living in less affluent areas. We as a business actively want to encourage them and give them opportunities to work from us and better their social station, earn more money, frankly. So we don't want to exclude that data. So that was a really good example of having the wisdom to understand the data and then the integrity to stick with the values that the company had put out there and make a decision that ultimately would cost them more because people will keep tending to leave, but really stick to the values that they've espoused as an organisation. So that's on the positive side. Companies are making really sensible decisions about what to do with data very often. On the negative side, a classic example, I guess, would be Uber. Uber took a decision some time ago, and we don't know how, we don't know why, we don't know who, but somebody in the organisation decided that they were going to make drivers, or sack drivers, just by sending them a message. So the driver just gets a message on the screen that says, you're no longer an Uber driver. They've got no knowledge, they can't go back and find out why, and Uber didn't put any sort of human appeal in there, so you can't go to somebody and say, I think the algorithm's got this wrong, I'm a great driver, you should keep me on the roster. So somebody took that decision that it was a good way to behave, and clearly they're a money-making organisation, they have the right to do that. My view would be, when you look at the responsible AI framework that I mentioned earlier on, transparency is really important to that. So to say to people, this is what we're doing, to say, if you get so many 1-star reviews out of however many, then you get one of these messages and you'll be sacked. Okay, that would be transparent. But they didn't do any of that. And it's not that difficult. If you're proud of how you work and what you stand for, you ought to be able to tell the world how you're using AI, at least in very broad principles, rather than just hiding behind corporate walls.
It's interesting. I mean, it raises 2 points actually. So before we met today, I asked an artificial intelligence program for some suggested questions that I could ask you. And there were 2 things that you've mentioned that sort of came up in those questions. And one of them was specifically around transparency, and particularly about, like, as we get to a point where I guess the quantum computers are starting to work, and those processes and algorithms and things are working at a level that's just so far beyond our capacity as human beings to understand what's happening. What hope is there for transparency? What hope is there for that sort of human interjection to say, actually, or how much control will we sort of not only be forced to, but also be tempted to cede to the computers, the algorithms, the artificial intelligence, whatever.
There's a big debate going on around the world at the moment, and in Bletchley Park a couple of weeks ago there was a big conference that the UK government set up on AI risk, and that was all about this question of what controls can we put in place today worldwide. It can't just be one country at a time. What global controls can we have that would allow us to control the machines in the event that we do get to this super intelligence at some point in the future? And the answer is nobody knows. And as people say, simple examples like, just have a plug you can unplug. Well, this doesn't really work like that. Imagine trying to turn the whole of the internet off. Where's the switch? There isn't one. So we are trying to think about how we could, as humans, have some involvement and some say in what that future might look like, but nobody really knows what the answers are. It's great conversations that philosophers have about it, but I guess where I work is very much more at the practical side. So we're working with companies to say, today, what are you doing with AI and what controls can you build in as an organisation? So some of the research that AI governance have done shows that 58% of boards have got nobody on them who even understands what AI is, let alone has ideas for how they might use it. And 91% of organisations have got no controls on their AI use. That's horrendous. It basically means that they are starting to use these tools, they're putting them in, they're using them in all sorts of ways, but without having a process of thinking through what are the consequences, how do we make decisions on what we should do and shouldn't do, particularly on these grey areas of ethics, or even just the technology. What sort of technological tools will we use and won't we use? So we really need people to get wise to those decisions about using AI today, and then perhaps we need the philosophers to think about that future super intelligence and how to control that.
Does that come back to this idea that we need people from diverse backgrounds to be part of the conversation about AI then? Because rather than just, I guess, scientists or businessmen or this, that and the other, maybe there is a scope for humanities people to come in. Because the other question that the AI put up that I wanted to raise, especially since you also raised it yourself, was that issue of biases. How do we stop the AI just from reflecting our own biases back to us as a society?
Yeah, so absolutely right. We do need diverse stakeholders in the room having these discussions, whether it's the big existential risk discussions or the practical day-to-day work. So when I'm talking to companies, we're always saying it's not good enough just to say, some people in data science or some people in compliance can make these decisions. No, you need people across the business to be bringing their full selves from lots of different life experiences into the room and having the discussions and debating and working things out. Lots of companies say to me, that's really slow. Yeah, it is slow. But once you get into it and you get people trained to do it, it does speed up. But inevitably, if you're going to have any sort of governance process, it can be a bit of a bottleneck. That's not a reason not to do it. That's a reason to perhaps train more people to get them in the room and share their experiences. On the existential risk point, we are lobbying very hard to try and get more voices in the room and allowed into the room to have these discussions. But you tend to find that there is a bias against people who aren't, the top PhDs in the world and who aren't running the biggest companies in the world in AI. They're the ones allowed into the room. Other people who are more diverse don't get a toe in, and that is really frustrating. On the point about the models and whether the bias is baked into them, bias is all around us. I find it hilarious. I quite often see people marketing tools to me saying, this tool will de-bias your data. No, it won't. By the very nature of the thing, all our data has bias in it, statistical bias, and quite often it has our human sociological biases baked into it as well. So to say we're going to get rid of bias is crazy. We won't get rid of it. What we need to do is appreciate where it is and think about what mitigations we need to take and think about, is it doing harm or not? Because sometimes just statistical bias is just observing the world as it is. It isn't necessarily doing any harm. So understanding data, and that's one of the things I really gained from my time here at Hull, so a much deeper understanding about data and statistical bias and how to appreciate it and how to interpret it and when to be worried about it.
Today, just to go back to that idea as well about the things you learned at Hull. Today you spoke to, I guess, some students who are in the position that you were in a few years ago.
Yeah.
What advice did you have for them about the influence that they can have in the world of artificial intelligence today, the things that you wish that you'd known when you were sitting in there? place.
Yeah. I think I'm just hugely encouraged that there's so many students coming to do this course now, because they are in a brilliant position with everything that's happened with generative AI over the past year to be out there after they've done their degree, whether they carry on researching or whether they go into the workforce. They're in a wonderful position to influence others and to be leading the generation who are perhaps running their organisations today, who don't know a fraction of the things that they'll learn in their year here. So they are in a fabulously influential position. I encourage them to think about potentially careers with regulators and standard setting bodies, because those bodies being set up around the world just don't have the talent there at the moment. So there's going to be lots of opportunities for people to go in and accelerate their careers really rapidly through organisations like that. So perhaps not always chasing the big bucks in organisations and going to work for organisations that pay you a fortune to be a data scientist or a machine learning engineer, but to actually do some good in society. So that was what I was really encouraging them to think about, and to always think about ethics. So rather than saying, well, that's something I did in my modules, I don't have to think about it anymore, because I get a lot of phone calls from data scientists who are working in businesses now who are kind of worried that there's nobody in the organisation that's giving them leadership, and they're saying, yeah, I remember this stuff from my course, and I remember having to think about it, but who do I talk to in the organisation? And the answer is there's nobody in the organisation that's thinking about it quite often. So they come to me, and I then try and help them influence back internally to say to their bosses and their bosses' bosses, we need to set up some governance mechanisms. We need to get people from across the organisation together to think about these things, rather than just saying, oh, so-and-so in data science will have to sort it out by themselves. That's not good enough.
Often I think like if that person who's working in data science might come up with a tool that they could use, and without that leadership saying to them, well, actually we need to consider X, Y and Z, or look at it from an ethical perspective, the company's probably just going to look at it and be like, oh, we're going to make so much money from this.
Yep.
If you could speak to someone who's in that position now, what might you say to them about the cost of not taking a step back and considering things rather than just leaping in and making all that money in the short term?
I always say to them, be brave. Be the one who does stand up and say, hang on a minute, just because we can doesn't mean we should. There's probably a way that we can still make money, but not actually do some harm. So let's just take a little minute, take a bit of time to think about what harms we might create here, and can we do this a different way, which still gets us the financial benefit we're trying to get, or the new customers, or whatever it might be, but without actually inflicting harm on different segments of society. So it's tough, if you're not at the top of an organisation, it is tough to lead from elsewhere, and there's whole books written on this whole thing about leading without authority, and it takes quite a lot of confidence to do it, but I do believe that certainly I come across a lot of data scientists who want to do that, and if they could just have a bit of help from outside the organisation or from other people in the organisation, perhaps compliance, for example, or legal teams, just backing them up, then that helps. So I'd say don't try and do it on your own, but get some help from somewhere else.
I was wondering if we could talk about the future, because like the AI, I think AI is sort of like makes us feel like we're stepping into the future, we're stepping into a brave new world. Everything's changing. What sort of trends are emerging, do you think, that even though we've seen change already, that's actually going to impact on people's lives in the coming years?
Yeah. We don't know. I mean, it's all changing so fast. And I think that's why this is different from other periods of change that we've seen driven by technology, where the change happens slowly over a period of a decade or more. Here, it's all happening incredibly fast. And I think that's why a lot of people find it threatening. So conversation that we just had with some colleagues, a lot of people were sort of saying, oh, I think this technology is disempowering me, or it's de-skilling me. I use my brain less. And other people have said to me, my job is less fun now because of generative AI. And all those things are valid, and that's the way people genuinely feel. I hope that over the next couple of years we'll go through a transition where people learn how to harness the power of these tools, learn how to use them with wisdom and integrity, and then they can say, actually, my job is now completely different to what it used to be, but that's okay. Like, jobs were different when we used quill pens and then calculators and then personal computers. So there have been all these changes, but I think it's a big challenge that it's happening so fast. There is a school of thought that says we're going to get to the point that in the not too distant future where nobody has to work and you'll choose to work if you feel like it. I don't know how that society is constructed, and I think it's a missing link that people aren't challenging those views more and saying, okay, how do we get from where we are today to a society where nobody works? How do you get food, for example? How do you get shelter? How do you get all the basics of life if you don't have an income that comes from working? My personal view on that is that we're not going to get there because there's too many vested interests that have interest in the assets that are in society, in capitalist societies for sure, and those people aren't going to let go of the value that's built into those assets. They would have to let go of the value built into those assets if we're going to get to this new economy where nobody works. So I think they will protect those and keep this working type economy that we're so used to.
Yeah, I think the same thing as well. Another thing that we sort of like discussed as well earlier was this like this idea of like the microchip implanted in your brain that helps you interface better with these technologies, or I guess gives you a competitive advantage in terms of what you're able to process and things. Yeah. I mean, is that stuff a pipe dream, or is that stuff...
It's happening. So Elon Musk, amongst others, is experimenting with this. He has a company called Neuralink, which has been implanting these chips into different animals' brains. And there are various other headsets, things that aren't actually implanted into the brain, which can apparently reconstruct music. So they can understand enough about the brain waves in order to reconstruct music. So there's definitely a huge amount of experimentation going on. There's one school of thought that says that this phase of human life is just a passing blip. So give it however many years in the future, and we won't be around as these sort of carbon-based life forms. We're just an evolutionary period in time that then disappears, and there's nothing that says that human life must carry on into the future. So that's kind of a tricky one to get your head around. And some people say that implanting chips into your brain is the stepping stone to humans disappearing completely. Time will tell. I'm agnostic on that one.
Because it's just because you mentioned earlier that work and life changed when other technologies came in, like calculators, pens, or I guess machinery in factories and stuff. And it did change. It was probably very painful for people when jobs were at stake and stuff. But this seems like it's not just technology that we might use as a tool, but that eventually will surpass us and maybe use us as a tool, or maybe...
Yeah, we could be designing the end of the human race unthinkingly, or maybe in the case of some people quite deliberately. Who knows? If they think they're going to be the few left to control all the machines and have all the assets, maybe it is some cunning design like that. I don't know. It kind of sounds like an episode of Black Mirror, doesn't it? But,
it does. To move away though from like maybe the negative or dystopian view of the future, like if you could imagine a more utopian view, what's like the optimistic view of the next 5 to 10 years, say?
I guess that's what I and various people like me around the world are all trying to work towards. We are trying to harness the power of this technology in a way that enhances humanity. When we hear various different governments around the world from very different cultures and societies who are saying that AI should be about enhancing humanity and it should be a pro-humanity tool, that's really very encouraging. I can certainly see some of the drudgery and some physical jobs disappearing as more automation comes through. So that could be really good, so people aren't doing jobs that are dangerous and potentially physically going to damage them. On the other hand, some of those jobs have been great for people who don't have the background or academic qualifications or life experience to get other sorts of jobs. So how do we help those people so they're not put on the scrap heap? And to give you one example, a company I was talking to recently, they need to move from people who are just very good at using Excel in the business to having people who can do artificial intelligence and data roles. Their first thought was, right, okay, so we sack the people who've done all the Excel spreadsheets in the past and we'll go out and we'll recruit some new graduates to do these higher level roles. And I said to them, you won't find them. There's just not enough of the graduates with these higher level roles that you're going to be looking for. So why don't you retrain the people who are good at using Excel? Because they understand your business really well right now. So don't get rid of all that knowledge and skill. Retrain those people. First step to use a fairly straightforward tool like Power BI. not that difficult to learn. If you're good at using Excel, you'll be okay with Power BI. That then gets you in the business of bringing different data sets together and seeing insights in data that you can't get from just an ordinary spreadsheet. And then from there, perhaps move them up into doing some low-code or no-code tools, so you're starting to use machine learning. So that's a path that they've gone down, and I'm really pleased that they have, rather than just saying, oh, you lot, we don't need you anymore, let's get in someone else. But I always do say to people, if you're in a job at the moment which largely involves collating data from different parts of the organisation and passing it upwards or sideways in the organisation, those jobs are history. Those jobs, they are going to go. So you need to invest in yourself and your own skills so that you are equipped for the future.
Well, I think that leads us on to an interesting final question, I think, to end with, which is, some people who are watching this podcast might already have a bit of an understanding of AI, but there might also be people who don't and don't know where to start.
Yeah.
And if we're thinking about reskilling or even just sort of broadening our knowledge of this really important trend, what could people do to educate or inform themselves and prepare themselves for this future?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most common things I get. So where do I go? How do I learn? There isn't an easy answer. The AI governance website, we have got a course on there which we put together to give people the basics of what AI is, to start thinking about it in the business context. And there are platforms like Udemy, for example, learning platforms, FutureLearn, where there are lots and lots of courses, variable quality, some are better than others, so you've got to kind of be willing to experiment and see which ones you like and which suit your particular purpose. But definitely invest in your understanding. That's the first thing. Second thing I always say to people is data. Just take some basic courses in statistics, because most people didn't do much of that at school. So to try and understand data and statistics better is fundamental to really appreciating what these tools can do. And then the third thing that I say to people is look at where you want to be in the future and start talking and having conversations with, whether it's your boss or colleagues or whoever, family members, to think about what you want to do. So rather than feeling that you're frozen at a point in time and you don't know how to move forward, start getting ideas, start learning, start thinking, because the world is going to change very rapidly over the next 5 to 10 years. And as one person in the session earlier on said, she wanted to be part of it, she didn't want to get left behind, and that's a really good attitude to say you're thirsty for knowledge and don't want to be left behind.
Because I think the scenario you posited before about turning the switch off, we're beyond that now, aren't we? There's no opting out.
No, there isn't any opting. I mean, you could go and live on a desert island somewhere or something and try and isolate yourself from it in the same way that you might say, I hate all modern society, I don't want anything to do with the internet. But most people, this is part of our world now, so it's about how we harness its power and get it to work for us, rather than letting it take over and steal the power from us. So again, that whole thing about trying to shift power back or keep power with us as individuals, rather than having it all go to the big corporates.
So this has been a really interesting conversation. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you very much for coming back on campus. Has it been an enjoyable visit back to campus?
Fantastic, yeah, fantastic to see all the progress and to see so many students and studying and doing amazing things. And also I love keeping in touch with students after they've graduated as well, and hearing their stories and what they're doing. It's a fantastic alumni that the university's created and is supporting. It's really good work.
I hope maybe in 5 years' time, if I'm still in this job and haven't been replaced by a cyborg, maybe we could get you back for another conversation about how it's developed.
Or we'll meet in the metaverse, yeah.
Thank you.